The situation on the Korean Peninsula has seen some dramatic developments in recent months, from the threat of nuclear war last year to now new levels of inter-Korean cooperation. In the midst of all this, now South Korea will be holding its annual Security and Defense Forum in the capital this week. Military officials and experts from all over the world will be gathered to take part in the Seoul Defense Dialogue, and there is particularly keen interest this year. Many will be wondering how changes in the relationship with North Korea will affect the security and safety in the region. To tell us more, we have with us the Deputy Director General for International Policy, Army Brigadier General Park Cheol-kyun from the Seoul's Ministry of Defense. It's an honor to have you on the show today.
My pleasure.
Now, I would like to start with first, if you could briefly introduce yourself, because I think our viewers would be very curious, especially in your impressive uniform. And also, can you tell us more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, which you're here to talk about?
Yeah, as already mentioned, I'm Brigadier General Park Cheol-kyun, and Deputy Director General for International Policy, taking care of all defense diplomatic affairs all over the world.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, what it's about and what the aim is for the government?
Well, the Seoul Defense Dialogue is a vice-ministerial multilateral security dialogue. It was started in 2012 to make relevant government officials, experts come together, share opinions, and come up with ideas for the peace and security of the Korean Peninsula and the globe. This year is the 7th year. The Seoul Defense Dialogue is growing in both quality and quantity with the increasing participants and diversifying agendas. This year, SDD has highest number, 52 countries participating, especially UK, UAE, and Uzbekistan are sending their vice ministers for the first time. It seems to reflect the international community's high interest in the Korean Peninsula.
So yes, as you've just said, 52 countries and 5 international organizations taking part, I understand. Now, in the first year, there was 15 nations and 2 international organizations. That's quite a growth in 7 years, as you've said. Do you think this shows the level of interest that the issues, the circumstances on the Korean Peninsula, especially with North Korea, has taken hold for the people in the world?
Yeah, I do think so. The denuclearization and the establishment of the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula are the global security issues. Do you recall last year's escalation to the brink of a war? It had a tremendous influence on peace and stability of both the Korean Peninsula and the globe. However, currently the Korean Peninsula is on a path of a dialogue without provocation for almost 300 days since the last missile launch. To my memory, we are experiencing one of the most prolonged peace on the Korean Peninsula since the Armistice Agreement. Though there are still many tasks to achieve complete denuclearization, yet its realization would contribute significantly to build the globally peaceful security environment. That being said, the international community is observing closely on how such matters will unfold.
I think when you held this forum last year, it would have been a very different environment, a very different atmosphere from this year. And I think that's reflected in the title for this year's event, which is Sustainable Peace from Conflict to Cooperation. Can you tell us about the events, how the events of the last few months have shaped the Seoul Defense Dialogue for this year? Has there been increased interest from international observers as well?
With the heightened threat from North Korea last year, the main agenda for the previous year's SDD was North Korea's nuclear and missile threat and the security of the Korean Peninsula. However, this year, as we are all aware, with the historical inter-Korean and the US-North Korean summit, discussions and measures for peace are being undertaken. Reflecting such a development, we have chosen sustainable peace as the main theme of this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue, and also denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and establishment of a peace regime as the theme of the plenary session 1, to gain wisdom through earnest discussion among distinguished global security experts.
In your preparations for this event, I'm sure you'll have talked to many of the counterparts that you'll be meeting coming to Korea. What has their response been over events of the last year? What are they interested in, and what are they looking to get out of this, this forum this year?
Well, the North Korean nuclear issue has been on the table for a while. And the international community has already come together to address the issue. We cannot deny that the international community's cooperative efforts played an integral role in bringing North Korea to the dialogue table. While Republic of Korea and the United States played a leading role, establishment of a peace regime and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula require international community's cooperation in various fields. Establishment of the peace regime can only be achieved with the agreement and support from not only neighboring nations such as the United States and China, but also the entire international community. Denuclearization also requires international cooperation in various fields, including experts and technical support, as well as cost and information sharing. This year's Seoul Defense Dialogue will provide the opportunity to share thoughts and ideas regarding these issues.
Now, as we mentioned, it's a very critical time with Korean Peninsula affairs, and this kind of forum is a way for people, for nations to communicate as well. But how is the South Korean government and military working together with the other partners in the region to make sure, that we secure peace and security in the Korean Peninsula?
The Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asia are geopolitical crossroads between the continental and maritime powers. Historically, during periods of distrust and competition, Northeast Asia has experienced conflict. It is therefore necessary for us to establish an environment of trust and cooperation. To realize such a cooperative framework, Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense continues to exchange and cooperation, as well as communication and dialogue with our neighboring countries. Centered around the solid ROK-US alliance, Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense currently endeavors in various efforts with China, Japan, and Russia. Those efforts are strategic dialogues, exchange visits between senior officials, training exchange, and establishing channels for mil-to-mil confidence building.
So what was also very interesting this year was the fact that North Korea had been invited to take part in the event which happened during the last military talks that the two Koreas had. Unfortunately, North Korea said they declined the invitation, saying that the two Koreas need to focus more on carrying out the Panmunjom Declaration for now. Yeah. How much is it a shame that not to have North Korea involved this year? And what do you think it could have been like if they had been involved?
Yeah, actually we provide the invitation on the 31st of July during the general officer level mil-to-mil talks in Panmunjom. And then we waited about a month, and then they sent us a message that they would not participate in the Seoul Defense Dialogue. So it is a kind of shame, and then we really hope that it would have been possible for them to participate.
If I ask one more question, if they had been involved, how do you think it would have changed the atmosphere? How do you think it would have affected how the Seoul Defense Dialogue would have run?
Well, with their participation, it would have been more dynamic and more active to have a real discussions regarding the security of the Korean Peninsula. But also, I think that considering their kind of systems and then their kind of a way of act, that it would have also very difficult for them to participate like us freely and dynamically in various issues.
Yes, I think it would have been very interesting to see them there. Hopefully in the future, sometime, we'll be able to get them in Seoul to take part in this sort of defense dialogue as well. Now, if you move on to another issue, someone who was invited before, but this year is coming, is China. Now, so for the last 2 years, China has not been involved because of the dispute with South Korea over the issue of the US missile defense system, THAAD. Now, since then, the relationship has been mended somewhat, and now they are coming back to Seoul. How significant is it that they are coming back to the defense dialogue and expressing their voice, and what can they bring to the event?
Well, as you have mentioned, China is sending a delegation composed of 9 members, headed by General Lee Maoji. China's participation in this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue signifies the restoration of the bilateral military relationship, especially after the summit in last December. We will normalize defense relations between two countries by the end of this year through senior officials meetings and defense cooperation.
Having China back in the mix, like how do you feel that changes the conversation in the dialogue? Because obviously they're a very big player in this region, and they have a lot of stake in for military-wise in this region. How does having them back change things?
Well, to bring about the real peace and security in this region, China cannot be excluded. They have a big influence, as you said. They are a big country. So with the participation of China, we can have a more realistic and substantial discussion regarding various issues.
Of course, the Seoul Defense Dialogue is not just about the North Korea issue. It's a global forum that's aimed to look at the other military and security concerns. What else is going to be covered this year?
There will be many issues, not only the denuclearization and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. We'll discuss about strategic balance in Northeast Asia, cybersecurity issues, maritime security issues, and then energy security issues. All those issues will be very globally interesting issues.
I think one of the issues you mentioned there was cybersecurity, and advances in technology nowadays must surely be a challenge for any nation's military. Part of the so-called fourth industrial effect, you might call it. How much of a topic has it grown at the Seoul Defense Dialogue over the years?
Cyber attack is dangerous enough to paralyze the whole nation, considering the level of how much the national infrastructures and our daily lives are dependent. Many countries are putting their utmost efforts to enhance their cybersecurity capabilities. However, these efforts are facing difficulties because of ambiguity in identifying the attackers and the lack of relevant international norms. Therefore, multilateral cooperation on cybersecurity is becoming more and more important, and the international community's cooperation for the standardization of a cybersecurity measure is required more than ever. Seoul Defense Dialogue has been hosting the Cyber Working Group since 2014, the director-level meeting for the practical cooperation and then discussion. Marking its 5th year, this year's Cyber Working Group will invite 20 countries to discuss tangible cooperation measures.
Let me ask you a bit more on that. Other than the cyber attacks, what other kind of advancing technology are there that are disrupting the traditional kind of military tactics and military planning and the safety and security of countries? And what do you think will be discussed in your dialogue as well?
Well, one of the issues that we are going to discuss is the extremism, terrorism. So under that issue, the relevant countries and participants will have a very proactive discussions too.
So having the Seoul Defense Dialogue, having it in Korea, in this part of the world, how important is it? Because, I mean, I'm sure there are defense dialogues and security forums all over the world, but having it in South Korea and in this region, why is it important?
As we have already discussed, the world is observing the dynamic security situations on the Korean Peninsula. With the Inter-Korean Summit and North Korea and the United States Summit, many things are changing in a very rapid speed. So the hosting the Seoul Defense Dialogue in Seoul will have a significant meaning for all the participants. So as I said, there are many newcomers for this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue.
And finally, what do you think needs to be done moving ahead now, looking ahead to the future of the Korean Peninsula? What needs to cooperation needs to happen and amongst the partners in the region?
As already mentioned, the various global security threats cannot be countered by a single nation. So in order to effectively respond to such threats, Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense and the Republic of Korea's armed forces shall actively cooperate with other countries. That being said, this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue will contribute greatly to this end.
Well, thank you for coming in today and sharing us your time and introducing us more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, and hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you.